It was Iraq's greatest joy, a wedding day, when the door would crash open and terror would step inside. Saddam Hussein held the nation in a vice, but it was his son Uday who weaponized state power for a new level of brutality, turning celebrations into hunting grounds for sexual violence. Families watched as brides were snatched at gunpoint. Later, organized networks scoured universities and clinics to fill a growing pipeline of victims. But how did one man twist an entire country's most intimate moments into machinery for pure horror? In Baghdad's elite neighborhoods, a wedding was supposed to be a family's proudest day. But by the late 1980s, fear crept into every celebration. Uday Hussein's name alone was enough to empty entire banquet halls. His arrival never came with warning, just the sudden roar of convoy engines, armed men spilling out, and the sick certainty that no one could stop what was coming next. Bodyguards blocked the exits, weapons drawn. Uday moved through the crowd, scanning faces, sometimes with a nod to his aides or a glance at the wedding videographer, who had already been paid to report the most beautiful women in attendance. The selection was quick and public. Brides were snatched from their own receptions, sometimes still in their gowns, as families pleaded and guests stood frozen. In at least one case, a groom who tried to intervene was shot on the spot. No police dared to respond. No one called for help. The abductions were brutal and efficient. Witnesses describe Uday's men dragging women through the crowd, shoving aside relatives, threatening to kill anyone who resisted. Some victims were forced into waiting cars, their cries drowned out by shouts and gunfire. At the Baghdad Hunting Club, a favorite haunt of the regime's inner circle, a bride vanished during her own wedding. Days later, her family learned she had died by suicide after being raped. When her husband demanded answers, he was executed for insulting the president. Wedding videos became tools of terror. Videographers were ordered to hand over tapes, which Uday's staff used to create lists of future targets. The knowledge that any celebration could be raided at any time led families to cancel plans, hide guest lists, or hold secret ceremonies. In some districts, invitations were whispered only to the closest relatives. Others simply stopped marrying altogether, convinced that any sign of happiness would attract Uday's attention. Latif Yahia, forced to serve as Uday's body double, recalled a wedding in Nineveh where a deaf girl was singled out and raped while her parents were held at gunpoint. In another notorious case, Miss Iraq, Ilham Ali al-Azami, was abducted from a party and disappeared for weeks. Survivors who returned were often changed forever, silent, traumatized, and threatened with death if they spoke. Doctors who treated injuries from these assaults were warned to keep quiet or face the same fate. By the end of the 1990s, the climate of fear was total. The sound of approaching engines, the sight of unfamiliar cars outside a wedding hall, or even the rumor of Uday's presence could empty a venue in minutes. Joy was replaced by dread. For many Iraqi families, the possibility of celebration had become a source of terror, a legacy that would haunt them for generations. By the mid-1990s, Uday Hussein's attacks on weddings had grown into something far larger, a nationwide kidnapping machine, run with the precision of a secret police operation. This wasn't just the work of a single man and his bodyguards. Uday's network reached deep into Iraqi society, with paid informants stationed in universities, hospitals, and even neighborhood clinics. These operatives were often teachers, nurses, or civil servants, ordinary people forced or bribed to supply names and details of the most beautiful women in their communities. A whispered tip, a phone call, or a note passed to one of Uday's aides could set the wheels in motion. Once a target was identified, the process moved quickly. Families received anonymous warnings: hand over your daughter, or risk the lives of everyone in the house. Some parents tried to hide their daughters with distant relatives or falsify school records, but the network's reach was nearly impossible to escape. Uday's men arrived at all hours, sometimes in government vehicles, sometimes in unmarked cars, always armed. Resistance was met with violence, fathers and brothers beaten or killed in front of their families. In at least 2 cases, entire households were executed after refusing to surrender a daughter. The message was clear: defiance meant death. Victims were often taken to hidden rooms in Uday's palaces or safe houses scattered across Baghdad. There, they were stripped of their identities. No contact with the outside world, no hope of rescue. Some were held for months, forced into sexual slavery and subjected to repeated assaults. Survivors later described being branded with heated metal, a permanent mark burned into their skin as a sign of ownership. For those who tried to escape, the punishment was even more severe. Uday's guards staged public executions in palace courtyards or dumped mutilated bodies in city streets, making examples of the women who dared to resist. The intelligence network didn't stop at abduction. It monitored families, tracked rumors of escape, and silenced anyone who spoke out. Doctors who treated injuries from these attacks were threatened or disappeared. Teachers who raised concerns about missing students were forced to sign statements of silence. Even wedding planners and photographers were pressed into service, their guest lists and videos feeding the pipeline of potential victims. Payments for information were generous, but the consequences for refusal were fatal. By the end of the decade, the fear was all-consuming. The knowledge that a single report could destroy a family made ordinary Iraqis complicit in their own oppression. Uday's system turned neighbors into informants, teachers into spies, and celebrations into traps. The threat was everywhere, and no one, no matter how careful, could ever feel safe again. Uday Hussein's grip on the Iraqi Olympic Committee began in 1984, when he was appointed president at just 20 years old. From the start, the organization became his private domain. Guards patrolled the gates, senior officials answered only to him, and every major decision passed through his office. For athletes and staff, the lines between sport and survival blurred quickly. Coaches were ordered to deliver their most promising female athletes to Uday's headquarters for so-called private evaluations. These sessions, always behind locked doors, had nothing to do with training or medical assessment. Instead, young women, some recruited as teenagers, were forced to submit to sexual assault. Refusal or poor performance in competition brought new rounds of abuse. No one questioned the orders. Coaches who tried to intervene lost their jobs or simply disappeared. Medical staff were forced to falsify records or ignore injuries. The fear was constant. Inside the compound, Uday's authority was absolute. Armed guards escorted athletes from practice to his office, then back to their dormitories, often without a word. Some girls vanished for days, returning silent and withdrawn. Others were never seen again. The committee's lower floors hid windowless rooms, converted storage spaces equipped with beds and surveillance cameras. These were used not only for rape, but also for blackmail. Uday kept tapes of his assaults, threatening to release them if victims or their families spoke out. In some cases, he forced athletes into prostitution, sending them to entertain foreign guests or government officials as payment for diplomatic favors. Those who resisted faced beatings, imprisonment, or worse. Senior administrators, including deputies like Asil Tabra, enforced Uday's rules. Staff meetings became scenes of intimidation, with lists of disloyal employees read aloud and warnings issued in front of terrified subordinates. Even Olympic doctors were forced to participate, sometimes ordered to examine girls for signs of sexual activity or to administer drugs that left them compliant. The entire system functioned as a network of coercion. Every layer, from coaches to security guards, complicit through fear or greed. By the late 90s, the Olympic Committee's headquarters in Baghdad was known among athletes as a place of dread. Whispers of hidden cells and missing girls spread through Iraq's sporting community, but no one dared to speak publicly. For Uday, the institution was not about medals or national pride. It was another machine for control, humiliation, and violence. In April 2003, as Baghdad fell, U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division teams entered Uday Hussein's most notorious palace on the banks of the Tigris. The compound was designed like something out of Arabian Nights: ornate domes, gilded halls, and behind every locked door, another secret. What the investigators found inside went far beyond rumor or survivor testimony. Room by room, the evidence told its own story. The first floor held a maze of soundproofed chambers, walls lined with thick insulation, steel-reinforced doors, and bolt locks on the outside. Each room contained a single bed, a drain set into the tile, and a shelf stocked with narcotics and surgical gloves. In one corner, CID officers cataloged racks of whips, electrical probes, and custom-made restraints. Some devices were still stained with dried blood. Alongside the torture equipment, investigators documented boxes of HIV testing kits and sedatives, their labels in French and Russian. Forensic teams later confirmed that biological samples collected from these rooms matched DNA from multiple victims, both female and male. Hidden behind a false wall, they discovered a video archive. Hundreds of tapes, many marked only with dates or the names of families. The recording equipment was state-of-the-art, with remote-controlled cameras and editing decks wired into the palace's private quarters. These tapes were not just trophies. They were weapons, used to blackmail victims and their relatives, or to silence political enemies. CID logs from May 2003 list dozens of videos depicting rape, torture, and forced confessions, some with entire families present in the room. Further inside, investigators found a medical suite stocked with surgical tools, antibiotics, and large stashes of illegal drugs. The presence of so many HIV kits suggested a grim routine. Uday's staff screened victims before and after assaults, discarding those who tested positive. In a locked closet, they found journals and ledgers, lists of names, coded notes about deliveries and payments to palace staff. Some entries matched missing persons reports filed years earlier by desperate families. Every detail, every bloodstain, every lock, every videotape matched years of survivor testimony. The palace was not just a place of indulgence. It was a factory of systematic sexual violence, built to erase evidence, break spirits, and guarantee silence. The ghosts of its victims lingered in every room, their stories finally anchored in physical proof. Inside Uday Hussein's private chambers, violence and sexual assault were never separate acts. They were fused together, each feeding the other. Latif Yahia, forced to serve as Uday's double, described torture sessions where rape was only the beginning. Electric shock devices, some disguised as medical equipment, were used on victims while Uday watched. The pain was not a side effect, it was the point. Latif later said, "What made Uday sexually excited was violence. Rape was like a hobby for him." Doctors who treated survivors described burns on thighs and genitals, injuries that could only come from prolonged electrical torture. Some women were branded with heated metal, leaving scars that never faded. In certain sessions, Uday forced victims to assault each other, threatening death if they refused. The humiliation was deliberate, designed to break any sense of self-worth. Medical records, smuggled out by terrified staff, confirmed patterns of trauma, deep lacerations, electrical burns, and internal injuries. No police reports were filed. No one in the palace questioned what happened behind those locked doors. The cruelty was systematic, fueled by Uday's need to dominate completely. For those who survived, the physical wounds were only part of the damage. The memory of what happened in those rooms would last a lifetime. In the spring of 1991, as southern Iraq erupted in rebellion, the regime's response was swift and merciless. Republican guard tanks rolled through Shia neighborhoods, but the real terror began when the Mukhabarat arrived. Security forces cordoned off entire districts. Men were separated from their families, houses searched, and women dragged from their homes. Survivors recall the screams echoing through the streets as mothers and daughters were assaulted in front of husbands and sons. These acts weren't random. Human Rights Watch documented a pattern. Rape used as a weapon to punish communities suspected of supporting the uprising. In Basra, Najaf, and Baghdad's Shia quarters, families were targeted not for what they did, but for who they were. Orders intercepted by international monitors spoke of breaking the will of opposition strongholds. For many, that meant sexual violence carried out in public or filmed for later blackmail. Some tapes, recovered years later from Uday's palace archives, were labeled with family names, a threat that if anyone spoke out, the shame would follow them forever. 3 generations in some families suffered through these campaigns. Grandmothers, mothers, and daughters all carried the scars. The trauma didn't end when the tanks left. Entire communities were left shattered, trust destroyed, and silence enforced by fear. In the aftermath, few dared to speak, and those who did often disappeared. In classrooms across Baghdad, attendance lists became a source of dread. Uday Hussein's network reached deep into schools and youth clubs, searching for new victims among the youngest and most vulnerable. Teachers received unexpected visits from men in government cars, demanding to see student rosters or yearbook photos. Sometimes, a girl would be called to the principal's office and never return. Her desk stayed empty, her name erased quietly from the roll. Educators who asked questions were threatened or forced to sign statements promising silence. Some tried to hide students or warn families, but the risks were enormous. One headmistress vanished after refusing to cooperate. Uday's agents targeted, often selecting them from award ceremonies, sports teams, or after-school activities. Survivors recall being approached on the way home from school, offered rides by men in official uniforms, or summoned for supposed interviews about scholarships. The reality was far more sinister. Victims were taken to hidden rooms in palaces or safe houses, subjected to sexual assault, and then threatened with death if they spoke out. In several cases, families received hush money or were told their children had run away. The story of Miss Baghdad stands out. In '99, the 15-year-old pageant winner was abducted and raped by Uday. Her family was silenced with threats and payments. Police reports disappeared and her case became just one more secret in a city full of them. For every girl who vanished, dozens more lived in fear, knowing that even childhood offered no protection. The terror spread from schoolyards to homes, leaving a legacy of trauma that would last for generations. By 2003, U.S. investigators cataloged more than 50 torture devices, HIV testing kits, and hundreds of hours of blackmail footage inside Uday Hussein's palace. Official records confirmed that his sexual violence spanned from public wedding raids in the late 1980s to the documented exploitation. Survivors and eyewitnesses have described forced sexual assaults in Olympic Committee offices, abductions from family homes, and the systematic use of rape as a weapon during the 1991 Shia uprising. Yet, many files on his intelligence networks and inner circle enablers remain classified or missing, and the true number of victims is still unknown. Today, trauma from Uday's crimes lingers in survivor testimony and forensic evidence. The documented facts leave no doubt. Uday Hussein's reign was enabled by state power, and his pattern of sexual terror stands as one of the most thoroughly evidenced examples of state-backed abuse in recent history.